Hello, my name is Host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People, and in this episode of Talking with Famous People, I'm going to tell you all about American history from start to finish. Here we go. So, way back when, some Europeans came from Europe and they settled different places in America. Some English people went and they settled like where the East Coast is, main East Coast part, like New York and stuff. Some Spanish people came, they settled down like by Florida. Some French people came, they went up to Canada. And the British people were like, cool, this is nice. And they lived there for a while until some more British people came. And pretty soon, there was 13 colonies of British people in America. And those were the original 13 states. Anyway, those 13 colonies of British people became increasingly frustrated with the presumptuous rule of the distant monarch, King George of England. King George would impose taxation upon the colonists without asking their opinion about whether these taxes ought to be deemed fair or, in fact, imposed upon the populace. They proclaimed no taxation without representation because they felt as though only taxes that had the consent of the governed were legitimate. Thus did they throw some tea into the ocean. Yes, one day the British had come to America and they had brought on a ship a bunch of tea. And this tea was of great importance because people really, really valued tea back then. They thought, God damn it, if there's one thing and one thing only I could get that I would like to have right now, it would be some tea. And so when tea came on the boat, they thought, these are important things. And the government in England said, well, because they're important things, we shall tax them. And the Americans said, au contraire, English government, au contraire. Here's why. Because what we're going to do is we're going to dress up like Native Americans, board your ship, and throw your tea into the ocean, where it will be spoiled. Because as a dry good, throwing it into the ocean ruins it. Thus did they start this big conflict with the British. Originally over taxation, it spread to a general sense of malaise amongst the populace that grew to dissent and gradually fomented into rebellion. Now, this rebellion began in the form of lettered men writing treaties about liberty and government and the sort of thing. These treaties were specifically designed to explain the legal and moral and systemically necessary justifications for these United States extracting themselves from their existing relationship with their mother country, namely Britain. And these ideas and writings, debates, and other discourses engaged in by our founding fathers then eventually were coalesced into a document which is probably best called the Declaration of Independence. Eventually we did have an Articles of Confederation and then a Constitution and other documents stemming from these same principled arguments. Regardless, before we could get to that Constitution stuff, we had a war to fight. That's right, the British decided they weren't going to let us go without a fight, and they sent over some gentlemen that they deemed Redcoats. Now, these Redcoats were so named because of the outfits they wore. They were the British uniform, and they were bright red. And the reason they were bright red and British and in those redcoats was because they were fighting in an archaic fighting style of European king wars where they treated their people as though they were playing a game and they were pawns in their game, and they'd say, well, you dress up in this color and you dress up in this color and now you guys kill each other to see whose king is better. And they were still trying to fight that way. But the Americans didn't have any red coats. And so they only had to wear their regular colored coats, and they were all fairly drab in coloring, unfortunately. So they ended up being quite well camouflaged. They discovered that was one of the advantages of being limited to this drab colored clothing. And so they just shot at the British Redcoats when they saw them, and had a distinct advantage in that regard. And apparently the British were fairly slow to adjust, right? So they didn't think to themselves, aha, we are more visible than they, let us change garb. Instead, they persisted in their present course, clad in red, easy targets for the American sharpshooters. Keeping in mind, of course, that during this Revolutionary War period, the soldiers were all using muskets, which required a much more involved action prior to firing the weapon than a contemporary gun does. Namely, the pushing down of a little ball and some gunpowder and stuff with a stick, and then standing up and then lighting a little fuse and then going, pow! So it's a very slow sort of shooting. If you were, for example, being charged by a train, then you wouldn't want to use a musket to stop the train. Anyhow, so one day the British were like, fuck this, we're going to go kick some ass. They sent over a bunch of dudes and in boats. And then Paul Revere was walking around. I don't know what he was doing out. He was out late. He was partying or something. And he looked out to sea. What does he see? He sees some ships, I guess. Or maybe they come by land. I don't remember. Anyway, he either sees some ships or he sees some lands. And he goes and he rides through and says, hey, the British are coming. They're coming this way. Let's go fuck this shit up. And they do, sort of. But it's really just one shot, and it starts the whole war. And then what ends up happening, we shoot a bunch of them, they shoot some of us, but they're going to kick our ass, basically, until we're like, hey, France, come here. I want to talk to you. You don't like England, right? We don't like those fuckers are assholes. Listen, we're with you. We've always been with you. We've always loved you. We love your croissants. We think they're fantastic. We like frogs, too. We don't eat them, but you can have our frogs. That's part of our deal. We'll trade you all of our frogs for all of your weapons. It's a deal, said the French, and that's how we got all the French's weapons. Anyhow, so the French got together with the American. I think we got some Indian helpers too or something. And the British were at a big disadvantage for a number of reasons. Not only did they have the Redcoats, that they were thousands of miles away from their home base. And their supply chain was necessary to build and maintain here. They obviously couldn't supply themselves with boats unless they had a constant stream of boats coming over here, which they might have. Or probably they did. I don't know. Anyway, the point is, they could only hang for so long. And then eventually America won. And when we did, we started this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which was super anti-federalist. So it was like, let's have the least effective federal government we possibly can. For some reason, people didn't like it. I don't really know why. I think they should have just stuck with it, really, but they didn't, and they got rid of that one. And then they replaced it with the Constitution. And the Constitutional Convention is famously documented in American history, and you know, had all those famous founding fathers, and they would like sit around the room and they'd yell at each other about shit, and then they'd write shit down on a piece of paper, parchment though, it wasn't even paper, and one of the things they'd fight over is whose pen was the longest feather, because that was a big deal back then. All their pens were made out of super long feathers. So it was generally considered that if you had the longest feather, that meant that you had the most truth in you, in general. You were the wisest. So, you know, John Hancock had a small feather, but a big signature, which proved not that he was the wisest, but instead that he was the least subtle. So, everybody signed the Constitution, go back to their original states. Fine, everything's cool, right? Well, we got a president now, though, George Washington. And half the people are like, fuck it, what is this thing we got up there? This isn't even working. What is this fucking thing? I'm a Virginian. I'm not a United Statesian. That's ridiculous. Okay, well, fair enough, Virginia, but, you know, we got debts and shit. We got to pay the French back. Remember, we borrowed all that money from them to fight the war. Yeah, we got to pay them back. Where are we gonna get that money from? States aren't paying us anything. That's why we gotta get the Articles of Confederation. That's why we gotta get this Constitution. Gotta pay us some shit, dude. All right, fine. Here's money, says Delaware. And pretty soon, the federal government's chugging right along. Now, at the end of the second term, you got George Washington there. What's going to happen? Have people say, you be king, George Washington. And George Washington's like, no. Number one, you're not going to call me your lordship or your masterful, holy, supreme, big cheese guy, or, your fucking special moisture or whatever fucking ridiculous names you have for me. You're just going to call me Mr. President. That's it. And no, I'm not going to run for a third term. I'm not going to hold office any longer. We need a change of power here. And that really was the launching of the American democracy, the first transfer of power. Because that's what constitutes real democracy, is transfer of power. Peaceful transfer of power. So that's chapter 1 of American history, from before Revolutionary War till after Revolutionary War. Thanks for watching. Talk about that, people.